Welcome to the Foundation in C# course series. My name is Tim Corey, and this is Module 5. In this module, we'll be building a small game based upon what we've learned so far. The game will be called Battleship Light. The purpose of building this game is to see how the various things we've learned fit together into a bigger picture. When studying C#, it's important to not just study the various pieces, but to also study how those pieces get used with other pieces you already know. That's why building a full application is so important. It's for understanding what you've been learning, understanding how it fits in a larger picture. So let's look at the basic requirements for the application we'll be building. We're going to build a small 2-player console game that has its roots in the game Battleship from Mattel. Now, if you remember Mattel Battleship, it was this grid. It was a 10 by 10 grid, and you put your ships on the bottom part of the grid, and you called out shots to the other person, and they said it was a hit or a miss. Okay, that's kind of the premise of it. Now, for us, we're going to do a 25 spot grid, not the full 100 spots. So just A1 through E5. So A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. And then B1, B2, B3, so on and so forth. Now, each player will place 5 pegs on the board to represent their 5 ships. So we're not going to have 2 long and 3 long and 5 long like Battleship does. We're just going to have a 1 peg that represents a full ship. So if you put your peg in A1, that's the entirety of where your ship is. So it's not going to be you've got half the ship sunk. It's either sunk or not. So the players will take turns firing on their opponent's ships. And the first person to sink all 5 ships wins. Okay, so it's 25 spots. You have 5 ships. Therefore, at most, it'll take 25 turns to get the game over. In reality, it'll probably be much shorter than that. Okay, and that's kind of the purpose. We don't want this long, drawn-out thing. So the reason we did ships that were just 1 peg large is because it makes it a lot simpler. Trying to figure out the orientation and which direction it goes and how those line up, that can get a little more complex with the logic. We just don't need to do that at this point. The purpose isn't to go really deep into logic. The purpose is to get our feet wet in building a full application from end to end. Okay, so we're going to start with just these requirements, and then we're going to walk through the planning process first. And that's really important, and that's why I wanted to get you used to the idea of, is when you build an application, you don't just start by writing code. We're going to start by planning it out first. Now, this is a small application, which means our planning process doesn't have to be very large. As we build larger and larger applications, our planning process will get larger as well. But for right now, we'll spend probably about 2 videos on planning the application. Planning is really important. One of the things it does, and we'll talk about this in the next couple of lessons, but one of the things that planning does is it eliminates bugs, which seems weird because you haven't written any code yet. But that's kind of the point, is when you talk it through on paper, if you can't describe your application on paper, then you can't put it in code. And that's just the way it is. So if you can't describe what your application does in detail without skipping over things, then you're not ready yet to put it into code. But what happens is when you skip over things or you don't really address parts of the logic, is that then you run into problems. And when you run into problems, you have to rework your code. And when you rework your code, you leave behind code fragments or your logic changes, but not all the way through. And so that's where bugs come in. It also slows your process down. So even though it takes time up front, it's critically important to plan your application first. After we're done planning, then we'll move into building out our models, the things that will hold data for us. Okay, and we'll do that in a class library for code reusability. After that, we'll create the methods on the front end, which the front end is the console application. We'll create some methods in there to prepare to get this game underway. And then finally, we'll hook up those methods by putting some methods in the code behind as well. So we kind of have three different places to put things: right behind the user interface, the console, some logic in the class library, and then some data modules or what we call models in the class library as well. So we'll do all of that. And once we're done that, we'll have a working application. And from there, we'll work on a little bit of debugging and testing. And we'll work through how do you make sure your application really is operating at the level it needs to be. For example, can we break it? And that's really important. A lot of times when developers first start writing applications, they think through the way it should work, and they test that. So for example, if I have I ask for two numbers, and I'm going to divide those two numbers. So number 1 divide by number 2, and then I'm going to give you the result. Well, the user might put TEST, test, in one of those numbers. Is it going to break something? It's probably going to cause some problems. Did you handle it? And you think, well, but that's not what I expected. And that's just it. That's not what you expected. So we're going to deal with those unexpected cases and make sure we've tested for unexpected things and try to expect the unexpected. All right. So once we've done all that, we'll have a working application that is simple, but it's a full application that creates a Battleship-light game. So once you're ready, click on the next lesson to get started on your journey.